In the gleaming corporate towers of Virginia's defense corridor, a 67-year-old executive was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as a triumphant contract signing took a shocking turn when they came face to face with calculated corporate greed. Laura Adamson wasn't your typical senior employee nearing retirement. For 4 decades, she had spent her life navigating Pentagon politics and billion-dollar defense contracts, known for her unbreakable network of military allies and encyclopedic knowledge of government procurement. When she encountered Marcus Chen's cost-cutting strategy that slashed her salary by 62% immediately after her greatest triumph, she had no idea she was walking into a war that would reshape the entire defense industry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the crystal chandelier as Laura Adamson set down her Mont Blanc pen with the quiet precision that had defined her 43-year career in defense contracting. Across from her, Colonel Michael Torres nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had just secured his nation's communications infrastructure for the next decade. The final signature on the $8 billion contract felt heavier than the paper it was written on, not just because of the zeros that followed the initial digit, but because Laura knew this moment represented the culmination of 18 months of delicate negotiations, relationship management, and strategic maneuvering that only someone with her institutional knowledge could have orchestrated. "Outstanding work, Ms. Adamson," Colonel Torres said, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. "The Pentagon has been watching this negotiation closely. Your ability to navigate the technical specifications while maintaining cost efficiency is exactly why we value our partnership with Meridian Defense Systems." He gathered his papers with military precision, each movement deliberate and economical. "I'll be recommending this as a model for future procurements." Laura's fingers traced the edge of the contract folder, a gesture that had become unconscious over the decades whenever she closed a major deal. She had built her reputation on moments like these, where technical expertise met human psychology, where understanding both the machinery of war and the machinery of Washington proved equally crucial. "Thank you, Colonel. It's been a pleasure working with you on the communications array specifications you outlined will serve our forces well." As the Pentagon officials filed out of Meridian's 20th floor conference room, Laura allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Potomac River curved lazily past the Virginia skyline, and she could see the Pentagon's distinctive shape in the distance, a building where she had first walked as a 22-year-old intern in 1982, starry-eyed and determined to contribute to her country's defense. 4 decades later, she had just delivered the largest single contract in Meridian's 47-year history. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had achieved this milestone at 67, an age when many of her contemporaries were settled into retirement's gentle rhythm. But Laura had never been interested in gentle rhythm. She thrived on the intricate dance of government contracting, where technical specifications met political realities, where relationships built over decades could make or break billion-dollar deals, and where understanding the unwritten rules mattered as much as mastering the written ones. "Magnificent work, Laura." The voice belonged to David Kim, her protege and Meridian's director of business development. At 35, David possessed the analytical sharpness that Laura valued, though she sometimes worried that his generation underestimated the importance of the human elements that made deals like this possible. "I was taking notes throughout the final negotiation. The way you addressed Colonel Torres's concerns about the encryption protocols while simultaneously offering cost savings, it was masterful." Laura turned to study David's earnest face, remembering when she had first interviewed him 8 years ago. He had been ambitious then, perhaps overly eager, but she had seen something in his questions about long-term strategic relationships that suggested he might understand that their business was built on trust as much as technology. "The technical aspects are important, David, but never forget that we're dealing with people who have to trust us with their lives. Every specification in that contract represents someone's son or daughter in a forward operating base who needs reliable communication." "Of course," David replied, though Laura detected the slight shift in his expression that suggested he was processing her words more as philosophy than practical guidance. It was a generational difference she had observed increasingly over the past few years. The younger staff members excelled at data analysis and market research, but they sometimes missed the subtle human dynamics that truly drove decision-making in their industry. As the conference room emptied and the cleaning staff began their efficient restoration of the space, Laura gathered her materials with the methodical care that had become second nature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to prove that experience and relationships remained irreplaceable assets in an industry increasingly obsessed with technological disruption and cost optimization. She had no way of knowing that 20 floors below, in the executive suite, CEO Marcus Chen was already discussing her future with CFO James Sullivan, viewing her not as the architect of their greatest triumph, but as an expensive liability whose usefulness had expired with the signing of the contract. The following morning brought the crisp October air that Laura had always loved about Washington autumns. She arrived at Meridian's headquarters at 7:15, as she had every workday for the past 12 years, carrying her usual coffee and the Washington Post, already mentally organizing her day around the post-contract implementation meetings that would ensure the Pentagon deal proceeded smoothly. Marcus Chen's assistant, Jennifer, approached her desk at precisely 9:30 with an expression that Laura's decades of experience reading people immediately flagged as significant. "Ms. Adamson, Mr. Chen would like to see you in his office when you have a moment." "Of course," Laura replied, saving her email and gathering the implementation timeline she assumed Marcus wanted to discuss. After yesterday's triumph, she expected this would be a congratulatory meeting, perhaps with discussions about her next major target, the Army's tactical communications upgrade that would likely go to bid in the spring. The executive floor's atmosphere struck her as unusually subdued, as she walked toward Marcus's corner office, where she might have expected the buzzed energy that typically followed major contract victories. She sensed something more guarded, more calculated. Marcus's secretary gestured her toward the closed office door without her usual warm greeting. Marcus Chen stood behind his desk, framed by the windows that offered commanding views of the Virginia suburb. At 42, he possessed the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted his trajectory toward success, his MBA from Wharton and consulting background at McKinsey evident in his precisely pressed suits and data-driven approach to leadership. He had been recruited to modernize Meridian 3 years ago, bringing what the board called fresh thinking to an industry they felt had become too comfortable with traditional methods. "Laura, please sit down." His tone was neutral, professional, but Laura's instincts, honed by decades of high-stakes negotiations, detected something underneath the surface. "I wanted to discuss some organizational changes that will be taking effect immediately." The word immediately sent a small alarm through Laura's mind, but she maintained her composed expression. "Of course, how can I help?" Marcus consulted a document on his desk with the deliberate movements of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "Given the successful completion of the Pentagon contract, we're implementing some strategic adjustments to our compensation structure. Your role will be transitioning to a more advisory capacity, and accordingly, your salary will be adjusted to reflect this change." Laura felt the first whisper of unease. "Advisory capacity? I'm not sure I understand." "Yesterday's contract represents just the beginning of our opportunities with the Pentagon's modernization initiative." "Yes, and we appreciate your contribution to that success." Marcus's voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone delivering difficult news to shareholders. "However, the board has determined that we need to optimize our cost structure to remain competitive. Your new compensation will be $207,000 annually, effective with your next paycheck." The number hit Laura like a physical blow. Her current salary was $34,000, a figure that reflected not just her title but her irreplaceable network of relationships and 4 decades of expertise. The reduction represented a 62% cut, transforming her from a senior executive to barely above an entry-level position's pay grade. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the comfortable reality she had inhabited for 12 years at Meridian was shifting beneath her feet. She had expected many things from this meeting: congratulations, discussions of future strategy, perhaps even a bonus reflecting yesterday's triumph. What she had not expected was to discover that her greatest professional victory had apparently been viewed as her retirement gift. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the maelstrom of thoughts racing through her mind. 43 years of experience had taught her that showing weakness in moments like these only invited further aggression. And this decision was made by the board. The board supports management's strategic vision. Yes, Marcus's answer was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the actual decision-making process. We believe this restructuring will position Meridian for optimal growth in the evolving defense market. Laura nodded slowly, her mind already beginning to process the implications with the same analytical precision she brought to contract negotiations. The timing was no coincidence. Wait until after the contract was signed, then eliminate what they perceived as an expensive redundant. It was the kind of short-term thinking that prioritized immediate cost savings over long-term strategic relationships, the kind of approach that someone with an MBA but no industry experience might consider innovative. I understand, she said, rising from her chair with the same composure she had maintained through countless difficult negotiations. I assume you'll want me to transition my current projects to other team members. David Kim will be assuming responsibility for your major accounts, Marcus replied, clearly relieved that the conversation was proceeding without drama. We'll arrange for a smooth handover over the next few days. As Laura walked back to her office, her mind was already shifting from shock to calculation. She had not survived 4 decades in the defense industry by accepting defeat gracefully. Marcus Chen and his board had just made a critical error in judgment. They had confused her age with weakness, her diplomacy with passivity, and her loyalty with naivety. They were about to discover how profoundly they had miscalculated. Laura's hands remained steady as she closed her office door behind her, though her mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired. The familiar surroundings of her workspace, the framed photographs from Pentagon ceremonies, the Crystal Award from the Defense Contractors Association, the handwritten thank you notes from military officials, suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's career. She had 15 minutes before her next scheduled call, 15 minutes to process the fact that her loyalty had been repaid with calculated dismissal. Her first instinct was to reach for her phone and call Maria Santos. If anyone could help her navigate the legal implications of this ambush, it would be Maria. They had met 20 years ago during a contract dispute that had threatened to derail Laura's then-employer's relationship with the Navy. Maria, then a junior paralegal, had worked 18-hour days to help Laura document the technical specifications that ultimately vindicated her company's position. Their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how power operated in Washington's corridors. Laura. Maria's voice carried immediate concern when she answered on the second ring. You sound different. What's wrong? I need to see you, Laura said quietly, glancing toward her office door. Something's happened at Meridian. Can you meet me for lunch today? Of course, the usual place at 12:30. Perfect. And Maria, I may need your professional advice as well as your friendship. After ending the call, Laura stared at her computer screen where her calendar displayed the next 6 months of meetings, negotiations and strategic planning sessions that would now belong to someone else. The weight of the moment settled over her, not just the personal betrayal, but the waste of institutional knowledge that Marcus Chen clearly didn't understand he was discarding. Her phone buzzed with a text from General Pat Morrison. Monthly lunch still on for Thursday. Looking forward to our usual strategic gossip session, Laura smiled despite her circumstances. Pat's message provided exactly the opening she needed. She typed back, absolutely, though I suspect this month's conversation will be more interesting than usual. The small bistro in Georgetown had been Laura and Maria's traditional meeting place for over a decade. Tucked away from the power lunch crowds that dominated downtown, it offered the privacy necessary for sensitive conversations. Maria was already seated at their regular corner table when Laura arrived, her sharp brown eyes immediately assessing Laura's composed but clearly troubled demeanor. Tell me, Maria said without preamble, her paralegal instincts recognizing the gravity of whatever had brought them together. Laura outlined the morning's events with the precise detail that made her such an effective negotiator, watching Maria's expression shift from surprise to anger to calculation. When she finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup in a pattern Laura recognized as her thinking rhythm. The timing is legally problematic for them, Maria finally said. Cutting your salary by 62%, immediately after you delivered their largest contract ever. Any employment attorney would call that constructive dismissal. We could argue age discrimination, retaliation, breach of good faith, and fair dealing. But, Laura prompted, hearing the hesitation in her friend's voice. But you know as well as I do that litigation would take years and would effectively end your career in the industry. By the time we won, and we might win, you'd be known as the woman who sued her employer, rather than the woman who landed the Pentagon's biggest communications contract. Laura nodded slowly. She had expected this analysis. The defense industry was small, insular, and unforgiving to those who disrupted its unwritten codes of conduct. A lawsuit would brand her as a troublemaker, regardless of its merits. So what would you do? Laura asked. Maria's smile was sharp. I'd remind them why they needed you in the first place. But first, I'd make sure I understood exactly what they think they're doing. Already working on that, Laura replied. Pat Morrison and I are having lunch Thursday. If anyone can help me understand the broader implications of what's happening at Meridian, it's her. Thursday's lunch with General Morrison took place at the Army-Navy Club, a bastion of Washington's military establishment where Laura's guest privileges reflected the respect she had earned over 4 decades. Pat Morrison cut an imposing figure even in civilian clothes, her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested military precision, her posture erect, her handshake firm enough to make younger officers take notice. You look like someone who's been thinking hard about something unpleasant, Pat observed as they settled into the club's dining room. What's Chen done now? Laura's surprise must have shown on her face, because Pat's laugh was knowing. Darling, I've been watching that boy stumble around the defense industry for 3 years. His McKinsey approach works fine for optimizing supply chains, but he fundamentally misunderstands that our business is built on relationships that take decades to develop. He cut my salary by 62%, Laura said quietly, the day after I closed the Pentagon communications contract. Pat's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her expression darkening. The arrogant little. She caught herself glancing around the dining room before leaning forward. Laura, that's not just personally offensive, it's strategically insane. Does he have any idea how many Pentagon procurement officers consider you their most trusted point of contact? Apparently not. Colonel Torres called me yesterday, Pat continued, her voice taking on the tone she had used when briefing senior Pentagon officials. He specifically mentioned how impressed he was with your handling of the technical specification. He said, and I quote, Adamson understands both the technology and the politics. That's rare. Laura felt a spark of something that wasn't quite hope but was definitely strategic possibility. What else did he say? He mentioned that there are several major communications upgrades coming through the pipeline over the next 2 years. Army tactical communications, Navy shipboard systems, Air Force satellite integration. We're talking about potentially $15 billion in contracts. Pat's eyes were sharp with understanding. Contracts that will require exactly the kind of institutional knowledge and relationship management that Chen apparently thinks he can outsource to David Kim. David's talented, Laura said carefully. David's 35 years old with 8 years of experience. Pat replied bluntly, I've worked with him on smaller projects. He's competent, but he doesn't have the network, the deep technical understanding, or the political instincts necessary for the major procurement. The Pentagon officials know him as your protégé, not as an independent operator. Laura absorbed this information while Pat continued her analysis. There's something else you should know. I've been hearing rumors about other defense contractors making aggressive moves to position themselves for the upcoming procurements. Lockheed's been quietly hiring former Pentagon officials. Raytheon's been expanding their government relations team. If Meridian's internal structure is unstable, if their key relationship manager has been marginalized, they become vulnerable, Laura finished. Exactly. Pat's smile was predatory. And in our business, vulnerability gets exploited quickly. Laura felt her strategic mind engaging fully for the first time since Marcus had delivered his devastating news. Pat, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to ensure that defense contractors were being properly evaluated for their stability and long-term capabilities, How might one go about raising such concerns? Hypothetically, Pat's expression was innocent. One might mention such concerns to key procurement officials during routine briefings. One might also suggest that the Senate Armed Services Committee should perhaps examine contractor stability as part of their oversight responsibilities. And you know people on the committee? I know Senator Hayes quite well. We've worked together on multiple appropriations over the years. She values competence and has little patience for corporate games that might compromise national security. Pat paused, studying Laura's face. She also happens to be someone who appreciates the institutional knowledge that comes with experience. As they finished their lunch, Laura felt the first stirrings of a plan beginning to form. Marcus Chen had made his move based on short-term financial calculation, but he had failed to consider that the relationships Laura had built over 4 decades weren't just professional courtesies. They were strategic assets that could be leveraged in ways he couldn't imagine. Pat, Laura said as they prepared to leave, would you be interested in some consulting work? I suspect I'm going to need an independent base of operations, and your expertise in Pentagon procurement would be invaluable. Pat's grin was fierce. Laura, my dear, I thought you'd never ask. Walking back to her car, Laura felt the transformation she had sensed beginning in Marcus's office, reaching its completion. She was no longer Meridian's senior vice president of strategic contracts, betrayed and discarded. She was Laura Adamson, defense industry veteran, with 43 years of relationships and institutional knowledge that no cost-cutting exercise could replicate. Marcus Chen had wanted to make her expendable. Instead, he had made her dangerous. David Kim stared at the spreadsheet on his laptop screen, the numbers blurring as his mind wrestled with what he had witnessed over the past 3 days. The transition meeting with Laura had been scheduled for an hour. They had spent what should have been a simple handover of accounts and contacts had become a masterclass in the intricate relationships that actually drove defense contracting. Relationships that David was beginning to realize he had never fully understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Laura had been methodical, professional, almost clinical in her explanation. Colonel Torres prefers morning briefings. He's sharper before lunch. Senator Hayes' staff responds better to written summaries than PowerPoint presentations. When dealing with Admiral Kowalski's procurement team, always address technical concerns before cost consideration. Each piece of advice carried the weight of years of experience, but David could see the calculation behind Laura's calm demeanor. She was giving him enough information to avoid immediate failure while withholding the deeper insights that only came from decades of relationship building. The cruelest irony was that Marcus Chen had announced David's promotion as a reward for his excellent collaboration on the Pentagon contract. David knew the truth. His contribution had been largely administrative. Laura had orchestrated every crucial moment, navigated every delicate negotiation, and solved every technical challenge that had threatened to derail the deal. Yet here he sat in his expanded office, nominally responsible for relationships he had never actually built. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, board meeting recap attached. Great work positioning yourself for the transition. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that will drive Meridian forward. David opened the attachment, finding a document that made his stomach clench. The board presentation outlined a systematic optimization strategy, targeting what they called legacy compensation structures. Laura wasn't an isolated case. She was the beginning. Over the next 18 months, Meridian planned to restructure the compensation of 12 senior employees, all over 55, all earning above $200,000 annually. The projected savings were substantial, the human cost entirely absent from the analysis. He closed his laptop and walked to the break room. Needing coffee and time to think, through the floor-to-ceiling windows he could see Laura's car still in the parking garage. She had been arriving earlier and leaving later since her salary cut, a schedule that suggested someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Rough week? The voice belonged to Jennifer, Marcus's assistant, who was refilling her water bottle at the cooler. You could say that, David replied carefully. Jennifer had been at Meridian for 8 years, long enough to understand the company's dynamics, but junior enough that her observations might be unfiltered. I feel bad for Ms. Adamson, Jennifer said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. My husband works in government contracting too. He says what they did to her is going to raise eyebrows all over the industry. David felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? Think about it from the Pentagon's perspective, Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. They just signed the biggest communications contract in their history with someone they've worked with for years, and 3 days later that person gets demoted to essentially an entry-level salary. If you were a procurement officer, wouldn't you wonder about the stability of your contract? The observation hit David like a cold wave. In his focus on the personal betrayal of Laura's treatment, he hadn't considered how it might appear to their clients. The defense industry operated on relationships and trust, two commodities that required consistency and reliability. Sudden changes in key personnel, especially changes that suggested internal instability, were exactly the kind of red flags that made procurement officers nervous. Has anyone from the Pentagon called? David asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Colonel Torres called yesterday asking to speak with Ms. Adamson about implementation timelines. When I told him she was no longer the primary contact and transferred him to you, there was this long pause, like he was trying to process what I'd said. Jennifer's expression was troubled. He ended up saying he'd call back later, but he hasn't. David returned to his office with Jennifer's words echoing in his mind. His computer showed 3 missed calls from Pentagon officials, 2 from Navy procurement, and 1 from the Air Force Communications Division, all requesting to speak with Laura specifically, all transferred to his voicemail when her direct line indicated she was no longer available. He had always prided himself on his analytical abilities, but sitting in Laura's former accounts, he was beginning to understand the difference between managing relationships and inheriting them. These officials didn't know him as David Kim, rising star of business development. They knew him as Laura Adamson's assistant, someone who took notes while she solved their problems. His phone rang, displaying Colonel Torres's number. David took a breath and answered professionally. David Kim, Director of Business Development. Mr. Kim, this is Colonel Torres. I've been trying to reach Ms. Adamson about some technical specifications for the communications array implementation. My understanding was that she was the project lead. Ms. Adamson has transitioned to an advisory role, David said, the corporate euphemism feeling hollow in his mouth. I'm now the primary contact for your account. The pause that followed was exactly what Jennifer had described, long enough for David to imagine the colonel processing the implications. I see, Colonel Torres finally said. Mr. Kim, I've worked with Adamson on multiple procurements over the past several years. Her technical expertise and understanding of our requirements have been invaluable. Are you familiar with the specific encryption protocols we discussed during the final negotiations? David felt his confidence crumbling. He had been in those meetings, had taken detailed notes, but Laura had handled all the technical discussions while he focused on contract language and timeline management. I have comprehensive notes from all our meetings, Colonel. Perhaps we could schedule a briefing to review the specific protocols you're concerned about. Perhaps, Colonel Torres replied, though his tone suggested this was not the answer he had hoped for. Mr. Kim, may I ask, is Ms. Adamson still with Meridian? I understand she's in an advisory role, but is she available for consultation on technical matters? The question placed David in an impossible position. The truth was that Laura was being systematically marginalized, her expertise dismissed as too expensive to maintain, but admitting that to a key Pentagon official would potentially damage Meridian's relationship with their most important client. She remains with the company, David said carefully. I can certainly arrange for her input on technical matters as needed. After ending the call, David sat in his office contemplating the impossible situation Marcus's strategy had created. The company needed Laura's expertise to maintain client relationships, but they had eliminated her incentive to provide it. They had cut her salary while expecting her to remain available for the knowledge and relationships that made those cuts possible. His computer chimed with an email from Laura. David, would you be available for coffee tomorrow morning? I'd like to discuss some concerns about the Pentagon implementation timeline. There are several potential issues that we should address proactively. David stared at the message, understanding that this was more than a casual invitation. Laura was offering him guidance, but she was also testing him. Would he choose loyalty to the mentor who had built his career, or allegiance to the company that had just promoted him over her diminished position? He typed his response, "Of course," the usual place at night. As he sent the message, David realized he was about to enter a conversation that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what kind of professional he wanted to become. Laura had spent 8 years teaching him about strategy, relationship management, and technical expertise. Now she was about to teach him about ethics, loyalty, and the true cost of corporate ambition. The lesson would begin tomorrow morning over coffee, in what David suspected would be the most important conversation of his career. The coffee meeting with David had unfolded exactly as Laura had anticipated. Over 90 minutes at the small cafe near Meridian's headquarters, she had watched her former protégé grapple with the realization that his promotion came with responsibilities he wasn't prepared to handle. His admission about Colonel Torres's concerns had confirmed what Laura already suspected: the Pentagon was questioning Meridian's stability. More importantly, David's obvious moral discomfort with the company's systematic targeting of senior employees had given her valuable intelligence about Marcus's broader strategy. Now, 24 hours later, Laura sat in the Pentagon's outer ring, waiting for her scheduled briefing with Colonel Torres about the communications array implementation. The meeting had been David's idea, suggested during their coffee conversation as a way to address the colonel's technical concerns. What David didn't realize was that Laura had already planned to request this exact meeting. His suggestion had simply provided the perfect cover. "Ms. Adams," a young sergeant appeared at her side. "Colonel Torres is ready for you." Laura followed the sergeant through corridors that felt like a second home after 4 decades of Pentagon meetings. The familiar sounds of military efficiency, purposeful footsteps on polished floor, the crisp exchange of professional conversations, the underlying hum of an organization dedicated to national security, reminded her why she had chosen this industry over potentially more lucrative private sector opportunities. Colonel Torres rose from behind his desk as she entered, his expression carrying the relief of someone whose concerns were about to be addressed by a trusted expert. "Ms. Adamson, thank you for coming in. I have to admit, I was surprised when Mr. Kim told me about your role transition at Meridian." "Organizational changes are always disruptive," Laura replied diplomatically, settling into the chair across from his desk. "But I want to ensure that our implementation timeline remains on track regardless of internal adjustments." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss." Colonel Torres opened a thick folder containing technical specifications and implementation schedules. "The encryption protocols we agreed upon require precise coordination between multiple systems. Mr. Kim seems competent, but when I asked him about the specific interface requirements between the satellite array and ground-based communications, he seemed uncertain." Laura nodded, having expected this concern. "The interface protocols are complex, particularly the authentication sequences. Would it be helpful if I walked through the technical architecture we developed during negotiations?" For the next 40 minutes, Laura demonstrated exactly why Marcus Chen's cost-cutting strategy was strategically flawed. She outlined technical details that existed nowhere in Meridian's documentation, explained implementation challenges that could only be understood through years of experience with similar systems, and identified potential problem areas that would require ongoing attention throughout the deployment phase. "This level of detail," Colonel Torres said as she concluded her explanation, "this is exactly why the Pentagon values long-term relationships with contractors who understand our requirements at this depth." Laura sensed her opening. "Colonel, may I ask about your perspective on contractor stability? In your experience, how do organizational changes at defense contractors typically affect project implementation?" Colonel Torres leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's one of our primary concerns, actually. We've seen too many cases where cost-cutting measures at contractors resulted in the loss of institutional knowledge. Projects that should have been routine became problematic because the people who understood the systems were no longer available. Are there specific indicators that raise red flags for the Pentagon?" "Several," he replied, warming to a topic that was clearly important to him: sudden changes in key personnel, especially on major contracts. compensation restructuring that might indicate financial instability, loss of technical expertise that can't be easily replaced. He paused, studying Laura's face. Miss Adamson, I hope you don't mind me asking, but your role transition at Meridian, is this part of a broader organizational change? Laura chose her words carefully, balancing honesty with discretion. The company is implementing what they call optimization strategies. There's a focus on reducing what they consider legacy costs while transitioning to younger personnel. Colonel Torres's expression darkened. That's concerning from our perspective. The communications infrastructure we're implementing will require ongoing support and modification over the next decade. We need contractors who understand not just the technical specifications, but the operational requirements that drive those specifications. I completely agree, Laura said. In fact, I've been thinking about the broader implications of these industry trends. Colonel, are you aware of any upcoming procurements that might require similar levels of technical expertise and institutional knowledge? The question was carefully phrased to sound like professional curiosity rather than intelligence gathering, but Colonel Torres's response exceeded Laura's expectations. Actually, yes, we're looking at several major communications upgrades over the next 2 years. Army tactical communications, Navy shipboard systems integration, Air Force satellite networking. The technical requirements are even more complex than what we just implemented with Meridian. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a confidential tone. Between you and me, we're concerned about the industry's capacity to handle these projects. Too many contractors are prioritizing short-term cost savings over the long-term expertise these systems require. Laura felt a surge of strategic clarity. Have you identified preferred contractors for these upcoming procurements? We're still in the early evaluation phase, but contractor stability is going to be a major factor in our selection criteria. We need partners who can provide continuity throughout the entire project lifecycle, not just the initial implementation. As their meeting concluded, Colonel Torres made a request that Laura had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Miss Adamson, would you be available to participate in some preliminary briefings about these upcoming procurements? Your insights into technical requirements and implementation challenges would be valuable as we develop our procurement strategies. I would be honored to contribute. Laura replied, although I should mention that my current role at Meridian might not provide the flexibility for extensive consulting work. Colonel Torres's smile was knowing. I understand completely. Perhaps we could explore alternative arrangements that would allow us to access your expertise while respecting your current professional commitments. Walking back to her car in the Pentagon's vast parking area, Laura felt the pieces of her strategy falling into place with satisfying precision. Marcus Chen had assumed that marginalizing her would eliminate her value to Meridian's competitors and clients. Instead, his actions had created an opportunity for Laura to position herself as an independent expert, whose knowledge was more valuable precisely because it was no longer exclusively available to Meridian. The Pentagon's concern about contractor stability wasn't just professional paranoia, it was a legitimate national security issue. Laura's 43 years of experience had taught her that successful defense contracts required not just technical competence, but institutional memory, relationship continuity, and deep understanding of military requirements that couldn't be replicated through corporate restructuring. Colonel Torres had essentially offered her a consulting role that would allow her to influence billions of dollars in future procurement decisions. More importantly, he had confirmed that the Pentagon viewed contractor stability as a critical evaluation criterion, a standard that Meridian's current trajectory would increasingly fail to meet. Laura's phone buzzed with a text from Pat Morrison. How did the Pentagon meeting go? Ready to discuss our consulting partnership? Laura typed her response as she started her car, better than expected. We need to talk about upcoming opportunities. Are you free for dinner tonight? As she drove away from the Pentagon, Laura reflected on the irony of her situation. Marcus Chen had tried to reduce her to an expensive redundancy, but his actions had instead transformed her into something far more dangerous to Meridian's future. An independent operator with institutional knowledge, Pentagon access, and no remaining loyalty to the company that had betrayed her trust. The next phase of her campaign was about to begin, and this time she would be playing offense. The dinner with Pat Morrison had lasted until nearly midnight, their conversation ranging from immediate tactical considerations to long-term strategic implications of what Laura now understood was a systematic transformation of the defense contracting landscape. Pat's connections ran deeper than Laura had realized, not just within Pentagon procurement circles, but throughout the congressional oversight apparatus that ultimately controlled defense spending. When Pat casually mentioned that Senator Elizabeth Hayes had been asking pointed questions about contractor stability during recent Armed Services Committee hearings, Laura had seen another piece of her strategic puzzle falling into place. Now 3 days later, Laura sat in the Hart Senate office building, waiting for what had been described as an informal industry briefing with Senator Hayes and her senior staff. The meeting had been arranged through Pat's recommendation, positioned as an opportunity for the senator to gain insights from a veteran defense contractor about industry trends affecting national security. Laura had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation, understanding that Senator Hayes represented a different type of power than Pentagon procurement officers, where military officials focused on technical capabilities and operational requirements. Senators concerned themselves with policy implications, constituent interests, and the political ramifications of defense spending decisions. Laura's approach would need to frame Meridian's cost-cutting strategy, not as personal betrayal, but as a symptom of broader industry problems that threatened national security. Ms. Adamson? A young aide appeared at her side. Senator Hayes is ready for you. Laura followed the aide through corridors lined with photographs of Maryland's military installations and defense contractors, visual reminders of the senator's constituency and the economic importance of defense spending to her state. Senator Hayes's office reflected both her military background and her current political role. Framed photographs from her service as a Navy JAG officer shared wall space with pictures of factory visits and ribbon cuttings at defense facilities throughout Maryland. Senator Elizabeth Hayes rose from behind her desk as Laura entered, her handshake firm and her gaze direct. At 58, she possessed the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in both military and political environments. Ms. Adamson, thank you for coming. Pat Morrison speaks very highly of your expertise, and frankly, I've been wanting to have this conversation with someone who understands the defense contracting industry from the inside. Thank you for the opportunity, Senator. I understand you have concerns about contractor stability. Among other things, Senator Hayes gestured toward a conference table where 2 senior staffers were already seated with thick briefing folders. I chair the Armed Services Committee, which means I'm responsible for ensuring that our defense appropriations are spent wisely and effectively. Lately, I've been hearing disturbing reports about changes in the industry that might compromise our national security. Laura settled into her chair, recognizing the carefully structured nature of this meeting. This wasn't casual conversation, it was a formal briefing where every statement would be recorded and analyzed. What specific concerns have you been hearing, Senator? Cost-cutting measures that prioritize short-term savings over long-term capability, Senator Hayes replied, consulting notes from her staff. Experienced personnel being replaced by younger, less expensive workers. Companies restructuring in ways that might affect their ability to fulfill complex long-term contracts. She looked up from her notes. Pat tells me you have first-hand experience with these trends. Laura recognized her opening, carefully framing her response to focus on industry-wide implications rather than personal grievances. Senator, I've observed a fundamental shift in how defense contractors approach their workforce and client relationships. There's increasing pressure from financial markets to optimize costs through personnel reductions, often targeting the most experienced and most expensive employees. And how does this affect contract performance? Asked one of the staffers, a woman in her 40s with the sharp demeanor of someone who had spent years analyzing defense spending. It creates continuity problems, Laura explained, Complex defense systems require institutional knowledge that takes decades to develop. When companies eliminate experienced personnel, they lose not just technical expertise, but understanding of how military requirements translate into practical solutions. She paused, allowing the implications to set. The Pentagon's current communications modernization initiative, for example, involves integrating systems across multiple military branches. That requires personnel who understand not just the technology, but the operational cultures of different military organizations. Senator Hayes leaned forward, her expression increasingly serious. Are you suggesting that cost-cutting measures might compromise the effectiveness of systems our military depends on? I'm suggesting that the industry is prioritizing financial optimization over operational excellence, Laura replied carefully. Companies are making decisions based on quarterly earnings, rather than decade-long contract performance requirements. The second staffer, a younger man with the intense focus of someone tracking complex policy details, consulted his tablet before speaking. Ms. Adamson, we've been reviewing Defense Department procurement data. Over the past 5 years, there's been a significant increase in contract modifications and timeline extensions. Would you attribute this to the workforce changes you're describing? Laura felt a surge of satisfaction. The senator's staff had clearly been researching this issue thoroughly, which meant her concerns aligned with data they had already collected.
In many cases, yes.
When experienced project managers leave or are marginalized, contracts that should proceed smoothly encounter problems that require modifications. Systems that should integrate seamlessly need additional engineering work. Timelines that were realistic under experienced management become inadequate under less experienced leadership. And the financial implications? Senator Hayes asked. Enormous. Laura replied. A contract modification that cost $10 million to fix an integration problem represents a false economy if the original problem resulted from eliminating a $200,000 per year engineer who understood the system requirements. Senator Hayes exchanged glances with her staff, and Laura sensed they were reaching a conclusion they had suspected but needed confirmed by industry expertise.
Then Miss Adamson?
The senator said, would you be willing to participate in formal hearings on this issue? The Armed Services Committee has oversight responsibility for defense contractor performance, and what you're describing suggests we need to examine whether current industry trends align with national security requirements. Laura felt her strategic position crystallizing. A congressional hearing would provide a platform to raise concerns about contractor stability while positioning herself as an expert witness rather than a disgruntled employee. I would be honored contribute to such hearings, Senator.
Excellent.
Senator Hayes made notes while speaking. I'm particularly interested in specific examples of how workforce reductions have affected contract performance. Can you provide case studies that illustrate these problems? Certainly, Laura replied, already thinking through examples that would highlight industry-wide problems without specifically targeting Meridian. I can also suggest other industry veterans who have observed similar trends. As the meeting concluded, Senator Hayes made a comment that exceeded Laura's most optimistic expectations. Ms. Adamson, I want to be clear about something. The defense contractors in my state employ thousands of people and contribute billions to our economy, but their first responsibility is to our national security, not their shareholders' quarterly returns. If companies are making decisions that compromise their ability to support our military, that's a policy issue that Congress needs to address. Walking back to her car through the Capitol complex, Laura reflected on how completely Marcus Chen had misunderstood the nature of her value to the defense industry. He had viewed her as an expensive employee whose expertise could be replicated by younger, cheaper personnel. What he had failed to grasp was that her expertise was inseparable from her relationships, and her relationships were built on trust that took decades to establish. Senator Hayes hadn't just offered her a platform to voice concerns about industry trends. She had essentially invited Laura to help shape congressional oversight of defense contracting. From Marcus's perspective, he had eliminated a costly redundancy. From Laura's perspective, he had freed her to operate at a level of influence that her previous corporate role had never permitted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Pat Morrison, How did it go with the Senate? Laura typed her response as she waited for her car in the parking garage. Better than expected. Congressional hearings are coming. We need to accelerate our consulting timeline. As she drove back toward Virginia, Laura allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Marcus Chen had wanted to marginalize her influence within Meridian Defense Systems. Instead, his actions had elevated her to a position where she could influence the entire defense contracting industry. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson would be expensive for everyone who had underestimated the value of experience, relationships, and institutional memory. Laura signed the consulting agreement with Morrison Strategic Defense Consulting on a gray November morning, using the same Mont Blanc pen that had closed the Pentagon's $2.8 billion contract 6 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now officially working for Pat Morrison's firm, positioned to advise Meridian's competitors on the same procurement opportunities that she had once pursued exclusively for her former employer. Pat's office in Arlington occupied the top floor of a building that housed several defense consulting firms, its windows offering views of both the Pentagon and the Potomac River. The space reflected Pat's military efficiency, clean lines, organized filing systems, and wall displays featuring photographs from her 15 years leading Pentagon procurement operation. What made the office particularly effective for their purposes was its complete independence from any major defense contractor, allowing them to work with multiple clients without conflicts of interest. "Welcome to the dark side," Pat said with a grin as Laura reviewed the final contract term. "Though I suspect Marcus Chen would argue we're not the ones who crossed ethical lines." Laura set down her pen and studied the strategic positioning chart that Pat had prepared for their first client brief. Morrison Strategic had been quietly building relationships with 3 of Meridian's primary competitors: North Star Defense Systems, Consolidated Communications Technologies, and Aurora Military Solutions. All 3 companies had been frustrated by their inability to compete effectively against Meridian's apparent advantages in Pentagon relationships and technical expertise. What they hadn't realized was that those advantages were largely dependent on institutional knowledge that Marcus Chen had just made available to the highest bidder. "Our first presentation is with North Star next Tuesday," Pat explained, pointing to calendar entries on her tablet. "They've been trying to break into the Pentagon's communications modernization program for 2 years, but they keep losing to Meridian in the final evaluation rounds." "What's been their primary weakness?" Laura asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Technical proposals that meet specifications but miss the operational nuances that Pentagon evaluators actually care about. They have good engineers, but they don't understand how military requirements translate into practical system design." Pat's expression was "No, sound like something you could help them with?" Laura smiled. "I think I might have some insights to offer." Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly attacking Meridian's market position, they would strengthen Meridian's competitors by providing the kind of institutional knowledge and relationship guidance that had previously been Meridian's exclusive advantage. Laura's 4 decades of experience with Pentagon procurement would help these companies craft proposals that demonstrated not just technical competence, but operational understanding. The first client meeting exceeded their expectations. North Star's Senior Vice President of Business Development, Catherine Walsh, had been struggling with a proposal for the Army's tactical communications upgrade, a $1 Tandirect, that represented exactly the kind of opportunity Colonel Torres had mentioned during Laura's Pentagon briefing. "We keep getting feedback that our proposals are technically sound but lack operational insight," Catherine explained, her frustration evident. "We meet every specification, but somehow Meridian always seems to understand requirements that aren't explicitly stated in the RF." Laura exchanged a glance with Pat before responding. "That's because the real requirements often aren't in the RF. They're based on operational experience, lessons learned from previous deployments, and understanding how different military branches actually use communication systems in field conditions." For the next 3 hours, Laura walked Catherine's team through the subtle factors that influenced Pentagon procurement decisions. She explained how Army communications requirements differed from Air Force needs, how operational security concerns affected system architecture decisions, and how maintenance capabilities in forward deployment areas influenced design specification. For example, Laura said, pointing to a section of Northstar's draft proposal, "Your encryption protocol meets the stated security requirements, but it doesn't account for the fact that Army units in remote locations often need to perform maintenance without access to specialized equipment." Pentagon evaluators know this, even if it's not explicitly mentioned in the RF. The transformation in the room was immediate. Catherine's engineers began asking questions that demonstrated their growing understanding of how technical specifications connected to operational reality. Their proposal manager started taking notes about presentation strategies that would resonate with military evaluators. Most importantly, the team began developing confidence that they could compete effectively against contractors who had previously seemed to possess mysterious advantages. Meanwhile, 12 miles away in Meridian's headquarters, Marcus Chen was discovering that competitive advantages built on institutional knowledge were more fragile than MBA programs typically acknowledge. James Sullivan had requested an urgent meeting to discuss what he called concerning market dynamics affecting their pipeline of upcoming contracts. "We're seeing unusual competitor behavior," James reported, consulting a spreadsheet that tracked their proposal win rate. "Companies that have historically struggled against us are suddenly submitting much more sophisticated proposals. Northstar's recent Army communications proposal was particularly strong. They demonstrated operational understanding that we've never seen from them before." Marcus frowned, studying the data James had compiled. "Are they hiring experienced personnel from other contractors?" "That's what's strange. We haven't seen any major personnel announcements from our competitors. No significant hiring of Pentagon veterans, no former military officers joining their business development teams." James paused, clearly troubled by the implications. "It's as if they suddenly understand procurement dynamics that took us years to develop. What about our current proposal? Are we maintaining our competitive edge?" James's expression darkened. "That's the other problem. Our proposal quality has declined since the transition from Laura to David, not dramatically, but enough that we're losing technical evaluation points that we used to win easily." Marcus felt a cold realization beginning to form. What kind of technical evaluation points? Operational insight, system integration understanding, maintenance consideration in design, exactly the kinds of subtle factors that Laura always seemed to anticipate. James consulted his notes. "David is technically competent, but he doesn't have the intuitive understanding of military requirements that Laura demonstrated." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but Marcus had already grasped the essential problem. In eliminating Laura's salary, he had saved $207,000 annually, but if that decision resulted in losing even one major contract to better-informed competitors, the financial impact would be measured in tens of millions of dollars. His phone buzzed with a text from David. Colonel Torres called again asking about technical specifications. "He seemed frustrated when I couldn't provide the level of detail he expected. Should I arrange for Laura to join the call?" Marcus stared at the message, beginning to understand that his cost optimization strategy had created a cascade of unintended consequences. Laura's expertise hadn't disappeared when he cut her salary, it had simply become available to his competitor. More troubling was the realization that he had no way to quantify how much institutional knowledge Laura possessed, how many Pentagon relationships depended on her personal credibility, or how many competitive advantages Meridian had lost when she became motivated to work against them rather than for them. "James," Marcus said quietly, "I want you to prepare a comprehensive analysis of our competitive position. Include contract win rates, proposal evaluation scores, and client feedback over the past 2 months. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." As James left his office, Marcus stood at his windows overlooking the Virginia suburbs, contemplating the possibility that his strategic masterstroke had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Somewhere in the Washington metropolitan area, Laura Adamson was applying 4 decades of defense industry expertise to help his competitors, and Marcus was beginning to realize that he had no effective response to that threat. The war for Meridian's future had begun, and Marcus was starting to suspect that he had chosen the wrong enemy. The revelation came to Marcus Chen on a Tuesday morning. delivered through a phone call that he would later recognize as the moment his carefully constructed corporate strategy began to unravel. Admiral Patricia Kowalski, the Navy's Director of Communications Systems, was calling to express concerns about Meridian's proposal for the shipboard communications upgrade, a $2.3 billion contract that Marcus had considered virtually assured, given their track record with naval systems. Chen, Admiral Kowalski's voice carried the no-nonsense tone that had made her one of the Pentagon's most respected procurement officials. I wanted to discuss some concerns that have emerged during our technical evaluation of your proposal. Marcus activated his phone's speaker mode, gesturing for James Sullivan to join the conversation from across his office. Of course, Admiral, what specific concerns can we address? Your technical specifications meet our requirements, but your proposal lacks the operational insight we've come to expect from Meridian. The integration protocols you've suggested don't account for the spatial constraints of destroyer-class vessels, and your maintenance procedures assume access to shore-based facilities that won't be available during extended deployments. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. These were exactly the kinds of operational considerations that Laura had always anticipated. The subtle requirements that separated successful proposals from technically adequate ones. Admiral, I can assure you that our team has extensive experience with naval communication systems. Mr. Chen, Admiral Kowalski interrupted. I've worked with Meridian for 8 years. Your previous proposals demonstrated deep understanding of operational requirements that this proposal simply lacks. Has there been a change in your technical team? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus glanced at James, whose expression reflected the same uncomfortable realization that was crystallizing in Marcus's mind. We've made some organizational adjustments, but our core technical capabilities remain strong. I see. Admiral Kowalski's pause suggested she understood more than her diplomatic language revealed. Mr. Chen, I should mention that we've received some remarkably sophisticated proposals from other contractors for this procurement. Companies that have historically struggled with naval requirements are suddenly demonstrating operational understanding that rivals your traditional strength. After ending the call, Marcus stared at his phone while James consulted his tablet, pulling up intelligence about their competitors' recent activity. The pattern that emerged was too consistent to be coincidental. North Star, Consolidated Communications, and Aurora Military Solutions were all submitting proposals that demonstrated unprecedented understanding of Pentagon procurement preferences. There's something else, James said quietly. I've been tracking some unusual industry activity. Laura Adamson's name has appeared on several consulting agreements filed with the Defense Contract Management Agency. She's officially working with Morrison Strategic Defense Consulting. Marcus felt the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Morrison Strategic, that's Pat Morrison's firm. The former Pentagon procurement chief, James confirmed. And according to my sources, Morrison Strategic has been advising several of our primary competitors over the past month. The full scope of what Laura had accomplished hit Marcus like a physical blow. She hadn't simply left Meridian to pursue independent consulting. She had strategically positioned herself to systematically undermine every competitive advantage his company had built over decades. Worse, she was doing it with the institutional knowledge and relationship network that Meridian had paid her to develop over 12 years of employment. Get our legal team on the phone, Marcus said, his voice sharp with anger. I want to know what recourse we have for an employee using proprietary knowledge to compete against us. The legal consultation that followed provided little comfort. Meridian's general counsel, Sarah Martinez, outlined the limited options available to them with the clinical precision that Marcus had once appreciated, but now found frustrating. Laura's consulting work doesn't appear to violate her employment agreement, Sarah explained during their emergency afternoon meeting. She's not sharing proprietary technical information or client confidential data. She's providing general industry expertise and strategic guidance, knowledge that could be considered her personal intellectual property rather than Meridian's. But she's using relationships that she built while working for us, Marcus protested. Professional relationships aren't proprietary assets, Sarah replied. Her contacts with Pentagon officials, her understanding of procurement processes, her knowledge of industry dynamics, these are considered personal professional capabilities, not trade secret. Marcus felt his options narrowing with each legal clarification. What about non-compete provisions? Her agreement includes a standard non-compete clause, but it specifically prohibits her from working for direct competitors. Morrison Strategic is a consulting firm, not a defense contract. Technically, she's not violating the non-compete by providing strategic advice to other companies. Desperate for some form of leverage, Marcus made a decision that would prove to be his first serious tactical error. That afternoon, he placed calls to 3 of Meridian's major competitors, attempting to pressure them to discontinue their use of Morrison Strategic Services. The call to Catherine Walsh at North Star Defense Systems went particularly badly. "Miss Chen," Catherine's voice carried barely concealed amusement, "are you seriously calling to complain that your former employee is helping other companies compete more effectively against you?" "I'm calling to point out that Laura Adamson is using knowledge developed during her employment with Meridian to assist your company," Marcus replied, his frustration evident despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. "Chan, Laura Adamson has 43 years of experience in this industry. She worked for at least 4 other defense contractors before joining Meridian. Her expertise doesn't belong to you. It belongs to her." Catherine's tone sharp, "And frankly, your attempt to interfere with our consulting relationships raises questions about your judgment that we'll be sure to mention to Pentagon procurement officials." The call ended with Marcus realizing that his heavy-handed approach had not only failed to achieve its objective, but had actually provided his competitors with additional ammunition to use against Meridian's reputation. 3 floors below Marcus's office, David Kim was experiencing his own moment of clarity about the ethical implications of Meridian's strategy. Colonel Torres had called that morning with pointed questions about the Navy proposal, expressing disappointment with technical specifications that failed to meet his expectations. When David had suggested arranging a consultation with Laura, Colonel Torres had delivered a response that crystallized David's growing discomfort with his position. "Mr. Kim, I understand that Ms. Adamson is no longer your primary technical resource, but I should point out that the Pentagon values contractor stability and continuity. When companies make personnel decisions that affect their ability to fulfill complex contracts, we take note." The implicit threat was clear. Meridian's treatment of Laura was being viewed by Pentagon officials as a potential indicator of corporate instability. David realized that his mentor's marginalization wasn't just personally offensive, it was strategically counterproductive in an industry where relationships and trust formed the foundation of billion-dollar contracts. That evening, David made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. He placed a call to Laura's personal number. "Laura, it's David. I know our last conversation was complicated, but I need to discuss something with you. Something about the company's direction that I think you should know about." Laura's response was carefully measured. "Of course, David. Would you prefer to meet in person?" "Yes," David replied, understanding that he was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change his relationship with Meridian Defense Systems. "There are some things happening that I think represent a threat to the company's future, and I believe you have a right to know about them." As David ended the call, he reflected on how completely Marcus Chen had misunderstood the dynamics he was attempting to manipulate. By creating an adversarial relationship with Laura, Marcus had transformed Meridian's greatest asset into its most dangerous threat. By alienating the Pentagon officials who depended on Laura's expertise, he had undermined the trust relationships that drove contract award. And by attempting to pressure competitors through legal intimidation, he had revealed a desperation that would only encourage more aggressive competitive behavior. The war for Meridian's future was escalating, and Marcus was beginning to realize that he had equipped his opponent with every weapon she needed to destroy the company he thought he was protecting. The convergence began on a cold December morning when Senator Elizabeth Hayes announced that the Senate Armed Services Committee would conduct hearings on defense contractor stability and national security implications in January. The announcement, buried in the second paragraph of a routine press release about committee scheduling, sent ripples of concern throughout the defense contracting industry. For Marcus Chen, reading the news over his morning coffee in Meridian's executive suite, it represented the materialization of his worst fears about the unintended consequences of his personnel decisions. "Did you see this?" James Sullivan burst into Marcus's office without his usual careful knock, waving a printed copy of the press release. Hayes is calling for hearings on contractor stability. She's specifically mentioned workforce optimization strategies and their impact on contract performance. Marcus set down his coffee, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that had become a daily companion since Admiral Kowalski's devastating phone call the previous week. "Do we know who's testifying?" "That's the problem," James replied, consulting his tablet with the frantic energy that had characterized his behavior since Meridian's competitive position had begun deteriorating. "The witness list hasn't been released, but my sources on the Hill suggest they're planning to call industry experts who can speak to workforce trends affecting national security." Marcus didn't need sources to guess who might qualify as an expert on that particular topic. Laura Adamson's 43 years of experience, combined with her recent visibility as an independent consultant, made her an ideal witness for hearings designed to examine exactly the kind of cost-cutting strategies that had defined his leadership at Meridian. The irony was almost unbearable. His decision to reduce Laura's compensation had been intended to demonstrate fiscal responsibility to Meridian's board and shareholders. Instead, it had apparently provided Senator Hayes with a case study in how personnel decisions could compromise national security interests. "There's more," James continued, his voice dropping to the cautious tone he used when delivering particularly bad news. "I received calls yesterday from Pentagon procurement officials expressing concerns about our proposal quality. Colonel Torres specifically mentioned that our recent submissions lack the operational sophistication that characterized our previous work." Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed strategy closing in around him. For 3 weeks, he had watched Meridian's competitive position erode as their rivals demonstrated unprecedented understanding of Pentagon requirements. The Navy shipboard communications contract that should have been routine had gone to North Star Defense Systems, whose proposal had exhibited exactly the kind of operational insight that Laura had once provided exclusively to Meridian. "What's our current pipeline situation?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. James consulted his spreadsheet with the mechanical precision of someone delivering an execution report. "We're tracking 12 major procurement opportunities over the next 6 months, totaling approximately $18 billion. Based on current proposal evaluation trends, our win probability has dropped from 73% to 41%. The numbers represented more than statistical decline. They indicated the systematic dismantling of competitive advantages that had taken Meridian decades to build. Marcus had saved $207,000 annually by restructuring Laura's compensation. But if their win rate continued to decline, Meridian stood to lose hundreds of millions in contract awards. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from David Kim. Colonel Torres called requesting immediate meeting about Army tactical communications proposal. "He sounds very concerned about our technical approach. Need guidance." Marcus stared at the message, recognizing another piece of evidence that his personnel strategy had created cascading problems throughout Meridian's client relationships. Colonel Torres had worked with Laura for years, had come to depend on her technical expertise and operational insight. David, despite his competence and dedication, simply didn't possess the institutional knowledge necessary to maintain those relationships at their previous level. 2 hours later, in a Georgetown restaurant where she had become a regular since joining Morrison Strategic, Laura was receiving a very different kind of update from David Kim. Their meeting had been David's idea, a continuation of his gradual transition from corporate loyalty to ethical whistleblowing that had accelerated since Marcus's heavy-handed attempts to pressure Meridian's competitors. "The board is asking increasingly pointed questions about our market position," David reported, his voice carrying the strain of someone caught between competing loyalties. Marcus tried to frame it as temporary market fluctuation, but the directors aren't buying it. They can see the contract loss patterns. Laura listened with the composed attention that had made her such an effective negotiator, processing David's intelligence while maintaining the careful emotional distance necessary for strategic thinking. "What specific concerns are the board members expressing?" "Cost versus performance metrics," David replied. They're starting to understand that cutting high-salary personnel might not generate the savings Marcus projected if it results in contract loss. The Navy shipboard communications loss was particularly damaging. That was a $60 million contract that we should have won easily. And Marcus's response to these concerns, David's expression darkened. He's blaming external factors, market volatility, increased competition, Pentagon procurement changes. He's not acknowledging that our proposal quality has declined since. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with directly criticizing his employer. Since I was marginalized, Laura finished diplomatically. Yet David's relief at not having to state the obvious was evident. Laura, there's something else you should know. Marcus has been discussing additional optimization measures, targeting other senior personnel. The same cost-cutting strategy that affected you is being planned for at least 8 other employees over the next year. Laura felt a surge of strategic satisfaction. Marcus's approach wasn't just personally vindictive, it was systematically destructive to Meridian's long-term capability. Each experienced employee he eliminated would further erode the company's competitive advantages, while potentially providing additional intelligence sources for Laura's campaign. David, Laura said carefully, I appreciate you sharing this information, but I want you to understand that your career prospects shouldn't be compromised by loyalty to me. If staying at Meridian serves your long-term interests, you should prioritize that. David shook his head. That's just it, Laura. I don't think staying at Meridian serves anyone's long-term interests anymore. Marcus's strategy is destroying the company's foundation, and the board is starting to panic about market share losses. Their conversation was interrupted by Laura's phone, displaying Pat Morrison's number. Excuse me, Laura said to David before answering. What's the news, Pat? Excellent news. Pat's voice carried barely contained excitement. Senator Hayes's staff just confirmed your testimony for the January hearings. You'll be the lead witness on contractor workforce trends. And Laura, they specifically want you to address how personnel decisions affect operational capabilities and national security. Laura felt the pieces of her long-term strategy finally converging with satisfying precision. When do they need my prepared testimony? 2 weeks. But Laura, there's more. The Pentagon has decided to conduct a comprehensive review of contractor stability metrics for all major procurements. They're evaluating whether companies that have made significant workforce changes should face additional scrutiny during the bidding process. After ending the call, Laura turned back to David, who had been listening with growing comprehension of the forces aligning against his employer. David, Laura said quietly, I think it's time for you to seriously consider your option. The company you joined 8 years ago no longer exists, and the company Marcus is creating won't survive the market forces he's unleashed. David nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. Aurora Military Solutions reached out to me last week. They're looking for someone with Pentagon relationship experience. Aurora is a good company, Laura replied. They've been making smart strategic decisions lately. What Laura didn't mention was that Aurora Military Solutions was one of Morrison Strategic's clients, and that their recent strategic decisions had been significantly influenced by her consulting advice. David's potential departure would represent another loss of institutional knowledge for Meridian while strengthening one of their primary competitors. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, David made one final observation that crystallized the scope of Marcus's miscalculation. Laura, I've been thinking about something. Marcus keeps talking about modernizing the company, bringing in fresh thinking, optimizing for efficiency. But this industry isn't like consulting or technology. Success here depends on relationships, trust, and institutional knowledge that can't be replicated through organizational charts or cost-cutting measures. Laura smiled, recognizing in David's words the understanding that had taken her 4 decades to develop. That's exactly right, Dave, and that's exactly what Marcus has never understood. Walking to her car through Georgetown's quiet streets, Laura reflected on the elegant progression of her campaign against Meridian. She had never needed to attack the company directly or engage in unethical competitive practice. Instead, she had simply allowed Marcus's own strategic blindness to create the conditions for Meridian's decline while positioning herself to benefit from the market opportunities his mistakes had generated. The hearings would provide a platform to establish new policy frameworks, that prioritized contractors' stability. The Pentagon's review process would create systematic disadvantages for companies that had eliminated experienced personnel, and Marcus's continued resistance to acknowledging his errors would only accelerate the pace of Meridian's competitive decline. The student had indeed become the teacher, and the lesson was nearly complete. The emergency board meeting was called for 7 a.m. on a Friday morning in January, 3 days after Senator Hayes's committee hearings had concluded, with devastating testimony about how cost-cutting measures in the defense industry were compromising national security. Marcus Chen arrived at Meridian's headquarters to find the parking garage unusually full for such an early hour, a clear indication that the board members who had flown in from across the country were treating this as a crisis session rather than routine oversight. The boardroom's atmosphere was glacial when Marcus entered. Chairman Robert Hartwell, a former Navy admiral who had recruited Marcus 3 years earlier with promises of modernizing Meridian's approach to defense contracting, sat at the head of the polished conference table with an expression that suggested his patience with corporate innovation had reached its limit. "Marcus," Admiral Hartwell began without preamble, "we need to discuss the company's current trajectory and the steps necessary to address what appears to be a systematic decline in our competitive position." The presentation that followed was devastating in its clinical precision. CFO Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to Pat Morrison, outlined Meridian's contract performance over the past 4 months, 7 major proposal losses, totaling $2 billion in potential revenue, declining evaluation scores across all procurement categories, and increasing Pentagon concerns about the company's stability and capability. "The most troubling aspect," board member Sarah Chen observed, "is that our competitors seem to have developed sophisticated understanding of Pentagon requirements that previously represented our competitive edge. Companies that have historically struggled against us are suddenly submitting proposals that demonstrate the kind of operational insight we've spent decades developing." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest as the board members systematically dismantled his strategic rationale. "We're facing increased competition across the industry," he offered. "Market dynamics have shifted." "Marcus," Admiral Hartwell interrupted, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command decisions. "We've retained McKinsey to conduct an independent analysis of our competitive position. Their findings suggest that our problems aren't market-driven, they're self-inflicted." The McKinsey presentation that followed was worse than anything Marcus could have anticipated. The consulting firm had identified a direct correlation between Meridian's personnel changes and their declining proposal quality. More damaging, they had traced the improved performance of Meridian's competitors to consulting relationships with Morrison's Strategic Defense Consulting, a firm that employed Laura Adamson as its senior technical advisor. The data indicate the lead McKinsey consultant explained with the dispassionate analysis that Marcus had once found reassuring that Meridian's cost optimization strategy has created a knowledge transfer scenario where institutional expertise developed over decades is now being leveraged by competing organizations. Board member Thomas Rodriguez, a former Pentagon procurement official, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Are you suggesting that our personnel decisions have effectively armed our competitors with our own strategic advantages?" "That appears to be an accurate assessment," the consultant replied. Adamson's testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee has also influenced policy discussions that may result in procurement criteria favoring contractors who demonstrate workforce stability. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the board members. Marcus's strategy hadn't just eliminated expensive personnel, it had transferred Meridian's competitive advantages to their rivals, while simultaneously creating regulatory frameworks that would penalize companies for the exact cost-cutting measures he had implemented. Admiral Hartwell's voice broke the silence. "Marcus, what's your recommendation for addressing this situation?" Marcus felt every eye in the room focused on him, understanding that his response would determine not just Meridian's future but his own survival as CEO. "We need to rebuild our technical capabilities and restore client confidence. That may require reconsidering some of our previous personnel decisions." "Reconsidering?" Dr. Chen's voice carried barely concealed incredulity. "Marcus, we're facing potential bankruptcy if we can't reverse our competitive decline. This isn't about reconsidering. It's about acknowledging that your strategy has been catastrophically wrong. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but Marcus understood that his authority had evaporated the moment the McKinsey analysis revealed the scope of his miscalculation. When Admiral Hartwell announced that the board would be taking direct oversight of recovery efforts, Marcus knew that his tenure as CEO was effectively over. 3 days later, Pat Morrison received a phone call that she had been expecting but still found satisfying in its implication. Admiral Hartwell's voice carried the careful diplomacy of someone making a request from a position of weakness. General Morrison, I'm calling on behalf of Meridian Defense Systems Board of Directors. We'd like to discuss potential consulting arrangements that might help us address some operational challenges we're currently facing. Pat's smile was sharp as she activated her phone's speaker mode, allowing Laura to hear the conversation from across Morrison's strategics conference room. Admiral, I'm always willing to discuss consulting opportunities. What specific challenges are you hoping to address? Our competitive position has declined significantly over the past several months. We believe that rebuilding our technical capabilities and client relationships requires expertise that we may have overlooked in previous strategic decisions. The euphemism was so obvious that Pat had to suppress a laugh. I see. And what role do you envision for Morrison Strategic in addressing these challenges? Admiral Hartwell's pause suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. We understand that Ms. Laura Adamson serves as your senior technical advisor. Given her extensive experience with our industry and her relationships throughout the Pentagon, we believe her insights could be invaluable in helping Meridian restore its market position. Laura gestured for Pat to continue the conversation while she listened, understanding that this moment represented the complete validation of her strategic approach. Marcus Chen had spent 4 months learning the true cost of underestimating experience, relationships, and institutional knowledge. Admiral, Pat replied. Ms. Adamson's expertise is certainly in high demand throughout the industry. Any consulting arrangement would need to reflect both the value of her contributions and the urgency of Meridian's situation. We understand completely. Would it be possible to arrange a meeting to discuss specific terms and expectations? Laura nodded to Pat, indicating her willingness to hear Meridian's offer. After 4 months of systematic dismantling of Marcus's strategy, she was prepared to consider the terms under which she might help rebuild what he had destroyed. Of course, Admiral. We're available for discussions whenever convenient for your schedule. As Pat ended the call, Laura reflected on the elegant completion of her campaign. Marcus Chen had wanted to make her expendable, to reduce her to a cost center that could be optimized away. Instead, his actions had elevated her to a position where Meridian's survival depended on her willingness to forgive their betrayal and return on terms that acknowledged her true value. The student had become the teacher, and the final lesson was about to begin. Laura Adamson walked through Meridian Defense Systems headquarters on a bright February morning, noting the subtle changes that had occurred during her 4-month strategic campaign. The elevator carried her not to the 20th floor where her former office had been located, but to the executive suite on the 22nd floor, the same level where Marcus Chen had delivered his devastating salary cut 5 months earlier. The irony was not lost on her that she was returning to the building as Chief Strategy Officer, with a compensation package that reflected not just her expertise, but the hard-won understanding of her irreplaceable value. The negotiations had taken 3 weeks and had been conducted with the precision of arms control treaty. Laura's terms had been comprehensive: a base salary of $425,000, 27% higher than her previous compensation, plus equity participation, comprehensive authority over strategic planning, and most importantly, formal oversight of all personnel decisions affecting senior staff. She had also insisted on the creation of an institutional knowledge protection program, designed to prevent the kind of short-sighted cost-cutting that had nearly destroyed Meridian's competitive position. Admiral Hartwell had accepted every condition without negotiation, understanding that Laura held all the leverage in their discussion. The board's desperation had been evident in their willingness to publicly acknowledge their previous strategic errors and to grant Laura unprecedented authority within Meridian's corporate structure. Her new office occupied the corner suite that had previously belonged to James Sullivan, who had been reassigned to a financial analysis role after the board determined that his Wall Street approach to defense contracting had contributed significantly to Meridian's competitive decline. The space offered commanding views of both the Pentagon and the Potomac River, a daily reminder of the relationships and institutional knowledge that truly drove success in their industry. Laura's first meeting as Chief Strategy Officer was with David Kim, who had ultimately decided to remain at Meridian after Laura's return guaranteed the company's strategic stability. His promotion to Senior Vice President of Client Relations reflected both his loyalty during the crisis and Laura's recognition of his potential when properly mentored. The Pentagon response has been remarkably positive, David reported, consulting notes from his morning calls with procurement officials. Colonel Torres specifically mentioned his relief that you're back in a leadership role. Admiral Kowalski has indicated that the Navy is prepared to reconsider Meridian for the destroyer communications upgrade, assuming we can demonstrate the operational insight that our previous proposal lacked. Laura smiled, remembering Admiral Kowalski's pointed criticism of Meridian's proposal quality during Marcus's tenure. What about our competitor positioning? How are North Star Consolidated and Aurora responding to our organizational changes? Cautiously, David replied. They understand that your return significantly alters the competitive landscape. Catherine Walsh at North Star actually called to congratulate you on your new role. I think she recognizes that the playing field has been leveled again. The observation was Laura's strategic campaign had never been about destroying Meridian's competitors, but about demonstrating the true value of institutional knowledge and relationship management. Now that she had returned to Meridian, the industry's competitive balance would be restored, with success determined by merit rather than artificial advantages created by strategic miscalculations. Her second meeting was less pleasant, but equally necessary. Marcus Chen entered her office with the careful demeanor of someone whose authority had been fundamentally diminished. The board had retained him as CEO, but his responsibilities had been restricted to operational management and financial oversight. All strategic decisions now required Laura's approval, a humbling arrangement that reflected the board's loss of confidence in his judgment. Laura, Marcus began, his voice carrying a humility that would have been unimaginable 5 months earlier. I wanted to discuss the implementation timeline for the Institutional Knowledge Protection Program. Laura studied his face, seeing genuine recognition of his errors rather than the defensive arrogance that had characterized his previous leadership style. I appreciate your support for the program, Marcus. The goal isn't to prevent necessary organizational changes, but to ensure that personnel decisions consider long-term strategic implications rather than just short-term cost savings. I understand, Marcus replied. The board has made it clear that my previous approach was short-sighted. I'm committed to learning from those mistakes. Laura nodded, choosing magnanimity over revenge. Marcus's public acknowledgement of his errors had been sufficient vindication. Her focus now was on rebuilding Meridian's competitive position and ensuring that the company never again underestimated the value of experience and relationship. The afternoon brought news that crystallized the success of Laura's strategic campaign. Senator Hayes's Armed Services Committee had approved new procurement guidelines that required defense contractors to demonstrate workforce stability and institutional knowledge preservation as part of their bid evaluation process. The policy changes directly influenced by Laura's testimony would systematically advantage companies that valued experienced personnel while creating additional scrutiny for organizations pursuing aggressive cost-cutting strategies. As evening approached, Laura stood at her office windows, watching the sun set over the Virginia suburbs, where she had built her career over 4 decades. Her phone displayed congratulatory messages from Pentagon officials, industry colleagues, and even former competitors who recognized her strategic brilliance in transforming personal betrayal into professional triumph. The most satisfying message came from Pat Morrison. Masterfully executed campaign. You've changed not just Meridian's trajectory, but industry-wide understanding of what drives success in defense contracting. Proud to have been your ally in this effort. Laura's reflection was interrupted by a knock on her door. Maria Santos entered carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose friend had achieved complete vindication. I thought we should celebrate properly, Maria said, setting the bottle on Laura's desk. You've accomplished something remarkable. You've proven that experience, relationships, and institutional knowledge can't be optimized away by MBA strategy. As they opened the champagne, Laura considered the lessons that Marcus Chen had learned through his costly education in the realities of defense contracting. His McKinsey approach had worked well for optimizing supply chains and reducing operational costs, but it had failed catastrophically when applied to an industry built on trust, relationships, and institutional knowledge that took decades to develop. You know, Laura said, raising her glass, I think this experience taught everyone involved something valuable about the true nature of competitive advantage in our industry. Maria clinked her glass against Laura, and about the dangerous game of underestimating people who built the very foundations you stand on. Outside, the lights of Washington began to twinkle in the growing darkness, illuminating the city where Laura Adamson had spent 43 years building relationships, developing expertise, and creating the institutional knowledge that no cost-cutting exercise could replicate. She had returned to Meridian not as the marginalized employee Marcus had tried to create, but as the strategic leader the company needed to survive in an industry where experience, wisdom, and relationships remained the ultimate competitive advantage. The Adamson gambit was complete, and the lesson would resonate throughout the defense industry for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.